Welcome. In this video, we'll cover LDAP integration for HPE GreenLake's dedicated platform, or as we call it, PCED. This solution now supports three authentication types, the local DB, SAML, and now LDAP. With LDAP added, the platform offers two federated options, SAML and LDAP. Let's quickly look at the login flow, CLI setup, and a short demo. Let's start by understanding the user login flow. When a user logs into the platform, the system performs a domain check based on the email address entered. Depending on the domain, the platform decides whether to use local DB, SAML, or LDAP authentication. In the case of LDAP, the request is routed through an SSO gateway which connects to the LDAP server for authentication. This diagram illustrates the authentication flow when LDAP is involved. The user enters their email address on the platform. The SSO gateway picks up the request, performs a password credential validator bind operation to the LDAP server, and authenticates the credentials. If successful, an ID token is generated and sent back to the platform, establishing a session for the user. The bind operation is where the actual credential check takes place. The LDAP server attempts to bind using the provided credentials. If the username exists and the password matches what's stored in the directory, the bind is successful and the user is authenticated. If either the DN or the password is incorrect, the bind fails and the access is denied. It is important to note this process only handles authentication. User roles and permissions and workspace access must be configured separately on the platform. Also, users must be invited to the workspace in advance. LDAP authentication alone does not create or provision user accounts. Let's move on to the demo. I'll show you how LDAP authentication works on the platform, starting with the LDAP configuration through the CLI, followed by the user invite process within the GreenLake private cloud platform. As of now, LDAP configuration is supported only via CLI. On a Windows machine, I will SSH onto the platform first to get to the LDAP configuration page. Upon a successful login, select option 4 for system configuration and then option 9 for LDAP configuration. First, we need to enter a few details to configure the LDAP server. Start with the server URL, which is the hostname of your LDAP server, along with the port it is using for LDAP connections. Next, provide the base DNN, which is the starting point in your directory structure where all the user accounts are stored. For the bind DN, use the specific user account that will authenticate with the LDAP server. In my setup, I'm using an account called administrator, which is already configured on the server. Then enter the claim domain, which is the domain you are claiming for LDAP authentication. After that, you'll set the session timeout. This determines how long the session remains active. Finally, enter the bind credentials, which are the credentials for the bind DN user, in this case the administrator account, used to authenticate against the server. Once you've filled out all these details, save the configuration and you're done with the LDAP CLI setup. Next, we'll switch to the platform UI to see how this configuration works in action. After configuring LDAP, we need to invite users to the platform. Remember, LDAP handles authentication only, so users still need to be invited and mapped to the appropriate workspaces before they can access the system. This process remains the same for MSP workspaces as well, where you'll assign users to one of the tenant workspaces or the MSP workspaces. The invitation process is identical whether the user authenticates through LDAP, SAML, or local DB. Similarly, this works for tenant percolation too. Once a domain is claimed at the MSP level, it automatically percolates down to all the tenant workspaces under the MSP. So I can invite a user directly to any tenant workspace inside my MSP account, and the domain would already be available there. I can assign the user to a specific customer workspace within my MSP, and that workspace will now be visible and accessible to the invited user. Now, let's log in as the invited LDAP user. Once we enter the email address, the platform will detect the associated domain and route the request to IDP broker, which then authenticates against the LDAP server. If authentication is successful, the user is logged into the platform and we see the two workspaces that we have given this user the access to. That wraps up our demo on LDAP integration for HPE GreenLake dedicated platform. Thank you for watching.